Right now, everything you have ever known is already gone. You just don't see it yet. There is a photograph. It is not a beautiful photograph, not in the way that word usually works. It does not show you vast mountain ranges catching the last copper light of an afternoon, or the surface of an ocean going silver under a rising moon. It does not frame anything that would, by most ordinary definitions, be considered dramatic. In fact, the first time most people encounter it, they squint a little. They lean forward. They try to find what they are supposed to be seeing, because what they are looking at seems to be almost nothing at all. It is mostly darkness, a deep, oceanic, absolute darkness that takes up nearly the entire frame. And then, scattered through that darkness, there are faint, diagonal streaks of light, artifacts of lens flare, tricks of the sun's radiation bleeding into the camera sensor from just off frame. These streaks give the image a strange, almost painterly quality, like someone has drawn a few loose brushstrokes across a very dark canvas. And somewhere in one of those streaks, if you know to look, if someone has told you where to aim your attention, there is a tiny, barely there speck of pale blue and white light. That is us. That is every human being who has ever drawn a breath, every war ever declared, and every peace ever signed, every song ever composed and then forgotten, every great city that rose slowly over centuries and then, just as slowly, fell back into the earth, every love story that felt, to the people inside it, like the most important thing that had ever happened in the history of existence. All of it, every single moment of the long, complicated, improbable story of our species, is contained in that mote of pale blue light, hanging in the dark, indistinguishable at first glance from a piece of dust caught in a camera lens. The photograph was taken on February 14, 1990, by a spacecraft called Voyager 1. By that point, Voyager had been traveling for over 12 years. It had passed Jupiter, then Saturn, then Uranus and Neptune, moving steadily outward, carried by the momentum of its own beginning, which was nothing more than a rocket ignited on a launch pad in Florida on a warm September afternoon in 1977. And as it crossed the boundary of what we consider our neighborhood, the rough zone where the sun's influence begins to weaken, where the planets thin out and the emptiness thickens, scientists asked it to do something that seemed, by any standard of mission planning, entirely unnecessary. They asked it to turn around, to look back, and Voyager did. With its camera pointing back toward the inner solar system, toward the warm, crowded neighborhood it had spent 12 years leaving behind, it took 60 frames of the sky, and in one of those frames, that speck appeared. Carl Sagan, who had been one of the voices pushing for this final act of cosmic introspection before the camera was shut down forever, called it the pale blue dot. And he wrote about it in a way that has never quite been matched, not for its technical precision, but for something else, something harder to name. He wrote about it the way you might write about something that has broken your heart cleanly in two, not with cruelty, but with simple and absolute honesty. But I am not going to tell you what Sagan said. Not yet, and not exactly. Instead, I want to try something slightly different. I want to sit with that photograph for a while, not as a scientist, not as a historian, not even as an admirer of Sagan's particular genius for making the cosmos feel both enormous and intimate at the same time. I want to sit with it as something stranger and more difficult. I want to sit with it as a question that has no clean answer, that does not resolve neatly, that leaves you in a state of feeling something you cannot quite name. Because that photograph, that pale blue speck in the dark, is one of the only images in human history that manages to be, simultaneously, the most humbling and the most extraordinary thing you have ever seen. It says, "You are nothing," and it says, "You are everything." And somehow, mysteriously, it manages to say both of those things at the same time, without contradiction, without irony, without the desperate need to choose one and discard the other. That tension, that quiet, enormous, almost unbearable tension, is what I want to explore today. Not to resolve it, but to live inside it for a while and to see what it reveals. To understand what makes that photograph so strange, you have to try, even knowing that you cannot fully succeed, to understand the scale of the distance from which it was taken. Distance, in the ordinary sense of the word, is something we feel in our bodies. We feel it in the ache of a long walk, in the hours of a road trip, in the slow accumulation of countryside passing outside a train window. Distance for us is something that takes time to cross and something that eventually ends. You set out from one place and you arrive at another, and somewhere in between, the distance has been used up. But the distance between Voyager and the Earth on that February morning in 1990 was not a distance in that sense. It was approximately 6 billion kilometers, a number that, when you say it out loud, sounds very large and means almost nothing. The human mind was not built for 6 billion of anything. We can hold a handful of stones. We can, with effort, imagine a room full of them. But 6 billion? The number simply passes through the mind without landing anywhere. So let me try a different approach. Imagine that you could travel at the speed of light. Not in a spacecraft, not in any machine we have ever built or could ever reasonably hope to build, but at the speed of light itself, the fastest that anything, by the laws we understand, can move through space. At that speed, you could circle the entire Earth 7.5 times in a single second. At that speed, the distance from the Earth to the Moon, which took the Apollo astronauts 3 days to cross, you would cover in roughly a second and a half. At that speed, the distance from the Earth to the Sun, which is vast enough that if you drove it by car, it would take you more than 150 years, you would cross in a little over 8 minutes. And at that speed, it would still take you 5.5 hours to travel from the Sun to where Voyager was when it took that photograph. 5.5 hours, at the speed of light. And the nearest star to our own, Proxima Centauri, a small red ember of a star that burns quietly in the southern sky, is more than 4 light years away. 4 years, at the speed of light. Which means that Voyager's position, when it turned and looked back at us, was not even a rounding error in the context of interstellar distance. It had barely left the room, and the Milky Way, our galaxy, the vast, slowly spinning structure of stars that contains our sun and all its planets and all of human history and all possible human futures, stretches for roughly 100,000 light years from edge to edge, 100,000 years at the speed of light. And the Milky Way is not particularly large as galaxies go. There are galaxies we have observed that make ours look like a small town compared to a sprawling continent. And beyond the galaxies, beyond the galaxy clusters, beyond the great filaments and voids of the cosmic web, the observable universe, the sphere of space whose light has had time to reach us since the beginning, extends for approximately 46 billion light years in every direction. I am telling you all of this not to dazzle you with numbers, because as I said, numbers of this kind do not dazzle. They simply fall away, soundlessly, into the incomprehensible. I am telling you because I want you to feel, as best as you can, the actual physical truth of what that photograph represents. When Voyager turned its camera around and captured that speck of pale light, it was not standing at the edge of the universe and looking back. It was barely standing in our own backyard. And yet, even from that modest distance, even from a point so close to Earth that on any cosmic map you couldn't fit a gap between the two, the entire Earth had shrunk to something smaller than a pixel, something less substantial than a grain of sand, something that, if you were not told what you were looking for, you would never think to notice. This is what distance does in the mathematics of the cosmos. It does not just separate things, it erases them. And there is something in that quiet erasure that deserves to be considered slowly, carefully, in the way you might consider a piece of music that you do not fully understand, but that moves you anyway. Because here is what strikes me when I think about the architecture of that distance. We tend to think of space as being between things. We think of space as the gap, the void, the nothing that separates the somethings. The Earth is here, the stars are there, and in between there is space, a kind of blank passage that things must cross to get from one to the other. But the cosmos does not experience itself that way. The cosmos does not experience itself at all, of course, in any sense that we can verify. But that aside, the perspective shifts enormously when you stop thinking of space as a gap and start thinking of it as the primary reality. When you let yourself absorb the actual proportions, the actual ratios, the staggering difference between how much of the universe is matter and how much of it is the absence of matter, you begin to realize something quietly disorienting. The universe is almost entirely empty. The planets, the stars, the galaxies, the nebulae, all the things we draw and photograph and name and study, occupy an almost laughably small fraction of the total volume of the universe. If you shrank the universe down to the size of a house, the matter in it would be less than a single atom. Everything that exists, every mountain, every ocean, every star, every galaxy, every black hole and pulsar and comet and cloud of interstellar gas, would together not fill the period at the end of this sentence. The universe is a vast, ancient, almost perfectly empty room in which a few extraordinary and improbable things have happened. We are one of those things. And Voyager's photograph captured that improbability with a kind of accidental artistry. By shrinking the Earth to a mote, to something barely distinguishable from a camera artifact, it told the truth about our position in the cosmos with a bluntness that no amount of abstract reasoning could quite achieve. It made the scale visible in a way that bypasses the rational mind and arrives somewhere deeper, somewhere where you feel the size of things rather than simply calculating it. And what it showed was that we are very, very far from being at the center. We are not in the middle of the galaxy. Our sun sits in one of the outer spiral arms, roughly 2/3 of the way from the galactic center to the edge. And our galaxy is not in the middle of anything either. It is one member of a small local group of galaxies, which is itself a minor outpost in a larger supercluster, which is itself one of many superclusters arranged along vast filaments of matter that span hundreds of millions of light years. There is no center to find. The universe has no middle, no edge, no special place where things are more real or more important than anywhere else. We are here, right here, in this particular, ordinary, unremarkable corner of an enormous and largely empty room. And somehow, we know it. And somehow, knowing it is one of the most extraordinary things about us. There is a quality to the cosmos that is very difficult to describe without either overstating it or undercutting it. It is not cruelty. The universe is not cruel. Cruelty requires intention, requires an awareness of the other, requires a choice to cause suffering rather than not. The universe has none of these. It does not choose. It does not notice. It does not, in any sense we can meaningfully detect, care. The word that comes closest is indifference. But even that word carries a slight implication of something that could care, but has chosen not to. The way a person might be indifferent to something, meaning they could attend to it, but have decided it is not worth their attention. The universe does not have that kind of indifference. Its indifference is more total than that, more absolute. It is the indifference of a mathematical process, of gravity doing what gravity does, of hydrogen clouds collapsing under their own weight, of stars burning through their fuel on schedules determined by physics long before the first living cell ever divided in the first warm, shallow sea on the first rocky world, to develop the right chemistry at the right temperature for long enough. The universe is a machine, an ancient, vast, unimaginably complex machine, running on rules that were apparently set at the very beginning and that have never wavered since. And this machine does not have a purpose in any sense that maps cleanly onto what we mean by that word. It is not going somewhere. It is not building toward anything. It is not, in the way that a story is, moving toward a resolution. It simply runs. Stars are born and live for millions or billions of years and then die, some quietly and some in enormous blazing explosions that briefly outshine entire galaxies. Planets form in the debris of those explosions, cool, develop crusts, sometimes develop oceans, and in some cases, in at least one case that we know of, develop the chemistry that leads to life. And then, eventually, the star they orbit enters its final phase, and the planet is consumed or frozen or otherwise rendered uninhabitable. And the galaxy moves on, and the universe moves on. And where that planet was, there is eventually nothing but a faint warmth that slowly cools toward the background temperature of space. This is not tragic in the way that we usually use that word. It is simply what happens. The Earth has existed for approximately 4.5 billion years. In that time, it has survived the late heavy bombardment, a period early in the solar system's history when the inner planets were pummeled repeatedly by the leftover debris of planetary formation. It has survived at least 5 mass extinction events, one of which killed perhaps 96% of all marine species alive at the time. It has survived the slow drift of its continents, the coming and going of ice ages, the impact of a rock large enough to end the Cretaceous period. It has, through all of this, maintained the conditions necessary for life to continue, to adapt, to diversify, to eventually, very recently in geological time, produce something like us. And none of that survival was intentional. None of it was earned. The Earth did not persevere. It simply continued, carried along by physics, by chemistry, by the particular configuration of our solar system that placed it at the right distance from a star of the right size to allow liquid water to exist on its surface. We were not chosen. We were not placed here. We are not the intended outcome of anything. We are the result of an enormous number of unlikely events occurring in a particular sequence over an enormous span of time, and the universe did not notice any of them. It did not notice the first cell. It did not notice the first fish to drag itself up onto land. It did not notice the first hominid to look up at the night sky and wonder what the lights were. It did not notice us. And yet, here we are, noticing it. That asymmetry, The fact that we look out at a universe that does not look back, that we search for meaning in a structure that contains no meaning of its own, that we feel things about a cosmos that feels nothing about us, is one of the most philosophically vertiginous facts of human existence. It is the kind of fact that, if you let it land fully, makes the ground feel uncertain for a moment. Not because it destroys meaning, but because it reveals that meaning is something that happens inside us, not outside. That the significance of things is not a property of those things, but a property of the minds that encounter them. The pale blue dot is a photograph of an indifferent universe going about its business. The pale speck of light it captured does not know it is being photographed. It does not know what a photograph is. It is simply there, continuing to spin, continuing to orbit, continuing to be the particular arrangement of matter and energy and liquid water and nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere that it has been for 4.5 billion years. But something on that speck, something extraordinarily fragile and extraordinarily new in cosmic terms, pointed a camera at itself from a distance and took the picture, and then looked at the result and felt something. That is not nothing. In fact, I would argue, quietly and without overstatement, that it is one of the most remarkable things that has ever happened in this particular corner of the galaxy. Because feeling something about the universe, being moved by its scale, being humbled by its indifference, being struck by the beauty of a dying star, or the strangeness of a black hole, or the thin, improbable miracle of a living world, is not a trivial achievement. It did not have to be possible. It is not the obvious result of matter existing. For billions of years, this universe contained no minds, no observers, no beings capable of wonder. It was, in those long eons, not experienced by anything. It simply was. And then, here and there, in the warm chemistry of a few worlds around a few stars, it became experienced. It became known. It became, in the strangest and most tentative sense of the word, witnessed. And we are the witnesses. Here on our pale blue dot, in our ordinary corner of an ordinary galaxy, we are the universe looking at itself. That is not something the universe intended, but it is something that happened. Let me try to tell you something about what is on that speck of pale blue light. Not in the way a textbook might, not the population count, or the land mass, or the GDP, or any of the other metrics by which we usually attempt to quantify ourselves. Let me try instead to tell you what it actually contains, in the way that a mind, rather than a measuring instrument, might understand it. On that speck, at this moment, there are people who are asleep, dreaming. They are in the middle of experiences that feel entirely real, landscapes that do not exist, conversations with people who are gone, emotions that arrive fully formed from whatever dark and luminous machinery the sleeping brain constructs its nightly theater from. And somewhere in those dreams probably is love, probably is fear, probably is the particular feeling of running towards something and never quite reaching it. Probably is the specific texture of the light in a room from childhood, preserved somewhere in the brain with a fidelity that no digital storage can match. On that speck, there are musicians playing instruments in concert halls, in small clubs, in bedrooms, on street corners, in studios, alone. They are engaged in one of the most mysterious human activities, the organized movement of air in patterns that cause emotional responses in other beings, for reasons that nobody has ever fully explained. Music is not necessary for survival. It does not help you find food or avoid predators or build shelter. And yet, it has been present in every human culture ever studied, going back as far as we have any evidence of human culture at all. We make sound and arrange it into patterns and then feel things about those patterns, and we always have, and we do not entirely know why. On that speck, there are children learning to read for the first time, sitting at small desks or on the floors of small rooms, moving their fingers slowly across the surface of pages, decoding the arbitrary marks that represent the sounds of words, and beginning, in those moments, to access a technology that will allow them to enter the minds of people who have been dead for thousands of years. This is what reading is, if you think about it plainly. It is a technology for time travel, a way of crossing the distance between living minds that is not measured in kilometers, but in centuries, in millennia, in the span between one human life and another. On that speck, there are scientists in laboratories, in observatories, in field stations, in deserts and on mountaintops, in submarines drifting through the dark water of the deep ocean, attempting to understand something. They are asking questions about how the universe works and then designing ways to listen for answers. This activity, systematic inquiry, the willingness to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere you did not expect or want to go, is, as far as we know, unique to us. No other species on Earth does it, and perhaps no other species anywhere does it. We simply do not know. On that speck, there are people in grief, people who have lost someone and who are navigating the enormous, shapeless weight of that absence. And there are people falling in love, which is its own kind of enormous, shapeless weight, felt differently, but equally impossible to explain from the outside. There are people who are sick, and people who are healing them. There are people who are frightened, and people who are sitting beside them. There are people building things, and people watching things fall apart. There are arguments happening, and silences being held, and hands being held, and children being born, and old people breathing their last quiet breath in the particular way that people breathe when the machinery is finally running down. And above all of this, above all the ordinary, extraordinary storm of human life on that small and fragile world, there is a sky. And in that sky, at night, there are stars, hundreds of them visible to the naked eye, thousands if the light pollution is low enough, and each of them a sun, many of them larger and older than ours, and around many of them, almost certainly, worlds. And the people on our speck look up at those stars and feel things about them, awe, or wonder, or longing, or the particular and almost untranslatable feeling that comes from staring long enough at a very clear night sky that you begin to lose the feeling of being separate from it. That feeling that you are not looking at the universe, but that you are, in some sense, the universe looking at itself. This is not a mystical claim. Or rather, it does not need to be. It is, in the most literal and physical sense, true. Every atom in your body was forged in the interior of a star. The calcium in your bones, the iron in your blood, the carbon that forms the backbone of every molecule in every cell of your body, none of it was made on Earth. All of it was made in the nuclear furnaces of stars that existed and burned out long before the Earth was formed. When those stars died, they scattered their material into space, and that material slowly coalesced and became new things. Planets, oceans, atmospheres, eventually life, eventually us. You are, literally, stardust, not as a metaphor, as chemistry. And so, when you look up at the night sky and feel something, when that particular unnamed feeling arrives, it is in a sense the cosmos recognizing itself. The matter that was once inside a star, experiencing what it is to be the matter that was once inside a star. The universe, folded back on itself in a way that allows for self-recognition. That is what the pale blue dot contains. Not just the noise and trouble and suffering and beauty of human life, but the only place we know of where the universe has achieved that particular, extraordinary trick of turning back on itself and wondering about its own existence. The only place, and perhaps there are others. Certainly, there may be others. Perhaps there are many others. But the only one we know of where matter has become curious about matter, where the cosmos has become, however briefly and imperfectly, conscious of itself. This is why the photograph matters. Not because the Earth is the most important place in the universe. It almost certainly is not by any objective measure. But because importance, as I said earlier, is not a property of things. It is a property of minds. And on that pale blue dot, there are minds. There is importance being made, being felt, being lived. The universe does not assign significance to anything, but we do. And the fact that we do, the fact that we can look at a photograph of our own world reduced to a speck and feel the weight of it, suggests that the capacity for significance is itself significant, even if only to us, especially because only to us. Everything that exists has a lifespan. This is not a sad fact exactly. It is simply the nature of things that exist inside time, which is everything we know of. The sun has approximately 5 billion years of hydrogen fuel remaining. 5 billion years is an almost incomprehensible span of time. Our entire species, in its current anatomical form, has existed for perhaps 300,000 years, which means the remaining lifespan of the sun is equivalent to roughly 16,000 human civilizations placed end to end. The sun has been burning for 4.5 billion years already, and it has, from our perspective, a very long time still to burn. But it will not burn forever. In approximately 5 billion years, the sun will have exhausted the hydrogen in its core and will begin to expand. It will grow slowly and then more rapidly into what is called a red giant, a phase in which its outer layers swell outward to distances far beyond where the inner planets currently orbit. Mercury will be consumed first, then Venus. The Earth, our pale blue dot, our home, will either be consumed as well, or, if it survives the engulfment, will be left as a charred and airless rock, the oceans long since boiled away, the atmosphere long since stripped, the surface hot enough to melt rock. By that point, if there is anyone alive on Earth, and there almost certainly will not be, because long before the sun reaches that phase, it will have brightened enough to make Earth's surface uninhabitable, probably within 1 billion years or so. But if there is anyone, they will look up at a sky filled by a sun grown enormous and orange-red, filling the horizon in a way our sun does not, and they will know that the end is near. Not just the end of them, the end of here. And then the sun will shed its outer layers in a cloud of glowing gas, a planetary nebula, beautiful and brief on cosmic timescales, and at the center, what remains will be a white dwarf. A small, dense, slowly cooling remnant, about the size of the Earth, but with most of the sun's mass compressed into it. It will glow for billions of years, slowly cooling, slowly fading, until it becomes too dim to see from any distance. And then it will be dark. Where the solar system was, there will be a dark remnant of a star surrounded by whatever debris remains. The outer planets may survive, cold and lightless, orbiting a dead ember of what was once a living star. And eventually, on longer timescales than I can really ask you to imagine, even those will drift apart, scattered by the slow gravitational effects of passing stars, and the material that was once our solar system will be dispersed back into the thin, cold gas of interstellar space. And it will be as if none of this happened, as if the Earth were never there, as if the oceans were never there, as if the first cell never divided in the first warm sea, as if the dinosaurs never ruled their long, warm Cretaceous afternoon, as if the first hominid never looked up at the stars, as if Rome was never built and never fell, as if every poem was never written and every song was never sung, and every child was never born and never grew up, and never one ordinary night looked up from a field and felt that particular unnamed feeling that comes from staring at a clear night sky for long enough. I want to stay here for a moment in this thought because I think it is important not to rush past it. The impermanence of the Earth, the fact that our pale blue dot has a definite beginning and a definite end, that it is not an eternal feature of the cosmos, but a temporary one, is something that most of us hold at a careful distance. It is too large a thought to carry comfortably in the ordinary flow of daily life. And so, we set it aside, the way we set aside most thoughts that are too large to be useful in the immediate moment. We think about dinner and deadlines and the small pleasures and irritations of being alive today, and we let the 5 billion-year future take care of itself. And this is not unreasonable. This is, in fact, probably the only sane way to live. The human mind was not designed to hold the end of the world as its constant companion. But there is something to be gained from visiting the thought, occasionally, with care, not in order to despair, not in order to conclude that nothing matters because everything ends, but because impermanence, when you look at it directly, has a way of clarifying things. The flowers are beautiful, partly because they do not last. The afternoon light through a window is precious, partly because it is moving, changing, already beginning to be something else by the time you notice it. The particular configuration of people and circumstances that makes up your life right now, the specific shape of this day, this hour, will never exist again. It is already, even as you experience it, becoming the past. And the Earth is the same, only on a longer schedule. This pale blue dot, suspended in its shaft of sunlight, is beautiful partly because it will not always be here. It is temporary in the way that everything temporary is both heartbreaking and precious. It is hanging in space the way a raindrop hangs at the tip of a leaf, complete, perfect in its moment, and already, always, in the act of letting go. The universe will continue after it is gone. The universe will continue long after the last star burns out, long after the galaxies disperse, long after the protons that make up all matter have decayed, if the theories that suggest they will decay are correct, leaving only the cold, quiet, almost perfectly uniform expansion of space, cooling toward absolute zero over timescales that make the current age of the universe seem like a quick preliminary. In that final state, the state that physicists sometimes call the heat death of the universe, there will be no light, no heat, no structure, no complexity, no life. There will simply be an expanding void, very slightly warmer than nothing, growing slowly and forever colder and emptier and more featureless. And that will be the end. Not a dramatic end, not an explosion or a collapse or a singular moment of catastrophe. Just a very long, very gradual fading. The way a fire does not die in a single moment, but becomes embers, and then becomes ash, and then becomes something that no longer glows at all, and finally becomes something cold enough that you cannot tell, just by looking at it, that there was ever any heat there at all. The cosmos will fade, and in that fading, everything that happened in its long middle, every star that burned, every world that formed, every creature that moved through any ocean or any sky, every mind that wondered about any of it, will be as if it never was. And yet, it will have been. It will have happened. The earth will have existed. We will have existed. The photograph will have been taken. Someone will have looked at it and felt the weight of it, the strangeness of it, the quiet grief and the quiet wonder of it. The fact that it ends does not unmake it. The fact that it will leave no trace does not mean it left no mark. It marked us. While we were here, it marked us completely. There is a way of looking at the photograph that I have not described yet. A way of looking at it that I have been circling around without quite landing on, because it is the most difficult thing to articulate, and I do not want to get it wrong. Or rather, I want to get it wrong in the right direction. I want to gesture toward it truthfully, even if I cannot quite reach it. It has to do with what it means to be small. We treat smallness almost always as a kind of defeat. To be small is to be insignificant, to be easily overlooked, to be the thing that does not matter in the larger scheme of things. We speak of small problems and big dreams. We measure importance in size, in reach, in the number of people who know your name. Greatness, in our ordinary vocabulary, is almost always associated with magnitude. And so when we look at the photograph, when we see ourselves reduced to a point of light smaller than a single pixel in the vast darkness, we feel, most immediately, something like diminishment. We feel small in the way that feels like less. Small in the way that suggests we have been caught in an exaggeration, that the stories we tell about our own importance have been gently but firmly corrected by a camera pointed at us from the edge of the solar system. But I want to suggest that there is another way to be small, a way of being small that is not diminishment, but something else entirely. Something that does not have a very good word in English, but that I think most people have felt at some point, even if they could not name it. It is the feeling you get in a very large, very old building, a cathedral perhaps, or a library with high ceilings and long aisles of books, where the scale of the space around you makes you feel not crushed, but somehow more present, more aware of your own edges, more conscious of the fact that you are here, specifically here, in this specific configuration of matter and experience, in this specific moment that will not come again. The largeness of the space does not erase you. It frames you. It makes you visible to yourself in a way that you perhaps were not before. And I think that is what the photograph does when you let it. When you let the full scale of the darkness in that image settle over you. When you let yourself understand as fully as the mind allows that everything you have ever known and everything you have ever loved and everything that has ever mattered to you is contained in that pale and almost invisible speck. When you let the weight of that compression land somewhere real in you, not as an abstract fact, but as a felt truth, something happens that is not despair, and is not quite awe, and is not exactly hope. It is something quieter and more difficult than any of those. It is something like recognition, a recognition that here is where we are, not at the center, not at the important place, not in the spot the universe designated for the significant beings who would eventually arrive to justify its existence. Just here, in this ordinary corner, on this temporary world, under this particular sky. And we are what is here. We are the thing that happened in this corner, the thing that, against very long odds, developed the capacity to be surprised by its own existence. And there is something in that, in the sheer specificity of it, in the fact that we are here and aware of being here, that the cold mathematics of scale cannot quite touch. Something that persists even after all the numbers have been processed and all the distances have been computed, and the full insignificance of our position has been acknowledged. Carl Sagan, when he wrote about the pale blue dot, arrived at something close to this, though he came at it from a slightly different direction. He wrote about responsibility, about the fact that because this is the only home we have, the only pale blue dot available to us, the only world where any of us can exist, it calls on us to treat it, and each other, differently, to understand that the long history of human conflict and cruelty and tribalism looks different from a sufficient distance, that the things we fight over, the territories and the doctrines and the pride, shrink to almost nothing against the backdrop of the void. I think he was right, but I want to add something to it, something that goes before the responsibility, that might be the ground from which responsibility grows. It is the simple fact of wonder. Before the responsibility, before the philosophy, before the political and ethical conclusions we might draw from the image, there is just the act of looking at it and feeling something. The act of being a small, temporary creature on a small, temporary world, looking out at an enormous and ancient and largely empty universe and being moved by it, being altered by it, even slightly, being unable to look at it without the feeling that something true has been revealed, even if you cannot quite say what. That act, the act of wonder, is not required by physics. It is not a survival advantage in any obvious sense. It does not help you find food or avoid predators. It does not build anything or solve anything. It is simply what happens when a certain kind of mind encounters a certain kind of truth and has nowhere useful to put it, and so instead of processing it, sits with it. And I think sitting with it is the right response, not resolving it, not finding the takeaway or the lesson or the conclusion, just sitting with the strangeness of being here, in this light, on this speck, looking out at all of that. Because somewhere out there, in those billions of galaxies, in those billions upon billions of star systems, across those distances that dwarf the imagination and silence even the most confident assertions about what is possible and what is not, somewhere out there, possibly, something else looks up, something else wonders, something else takes the photograph, or the equivalent of the photograph, and looks at its own world reduced to a point of light in the dark, and feels the weight of it. Or perhaps not. Perhaps we are alone. Perhaps this is the only place in all that immensity where the universe has achieved the trick of self-awareness. Perhaps the wonder is uniquely ours. Either answer is almost unbearable in its own way. If we are not alone, then the cosmos is full of minds moving through it, each one illuminated by its own brief light, each one looking out at the same dark and feeling something. A vast communion of wonder, dispersed across such distances that it will never gather, never communicate, never know itself to be a communion, each light isolated by the very scale of the universe it is trying to understand. And if we are alone, then all of this, the 100 billion galaxies, the trillions of stars, the vast oceanic darkness of the void, all of it exists, as far as we can tell, for an audience of one. One small world, one temporary species, one thin atmosphere of awareness stretched across the surface of a pale blue dot, looking out at everything and wondering why. Both possibilities make the photograph more, not less. I keep coming back to the image. Not the numbers, Not the philosophy, not the conclusions, just the image itself. The darkness, the streaks of light, and in one of those streaks, barely visible, the palest possible suggestion of blue and white. The most modest and underconfident of celestial objects if you did not know what you were looking at. But you do know. And because you know, the speck is not modest at all. Because you know, it contains everything. It contains the long, improbable story of life. It contains the first song ever hummed and the last word ever spoken. It contains every version of love that has ever arranged itself in the chemistry of a human heart. It contains the moment you were born and the moment you will end. It contains this moment, right now, of someone listening to words about a photograph, somewhere on the surface of a planet that looks, from the right distance, like nothing at all. It contains the capacity to wonder about itself. And that is not nothing. That is, given the silence and the scale and the cold indifference of everything around it, perhaps the most extraordinary thing there is.